So, good evening, friends, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the ULT London Lodge. Welcome to our friends and guests on Skype from home and abroad, wherever you may be. As you all probably know, tonight is the special commemorative meeting, the Founders' Day commemoration, when we celebrate the 141st anniversary of the founding of the modern Theosophical movement in New York on the 17th of November 1875. Now, it said the 17th of November was not chosen by chance. This date is significant in one sense because it is a birthday attributed to one of the Dhyani Chauhans. So, in that sense, it's quite symbolic and of what this commemoration or the founding of the TS represents or would represent at the time. And just a brief note on the concept of a founder or prime mover is another term we could use. Someone who has the initial impulse, vision, idea for starting a new movement or trend in society. The founder comes from the Latin noun fundus, meaning the bottom or foundation. First, there is the founder who raises an edifice or presides over the erection of a city. This role is antecedent to that of an architect, even that of the builder. It is the role of making possible and points to the idea of the imagination, the driving force, rather than the design or construction. Founder also applies in a broader sense to that of the originator, who institutes something for the first time. And thirdly, the founder in the specialized sense of one who casts metal or using a mold. This is the second Latin meaning of the word fundis and fundari, to pour, to melt, to mold. It requires, so all three meanings really combined in regards to the initial three founders of the Theosophical Society, Helena Petrovna Blavatskaya in Russian, William Q. Judge, and Colonel Olcott, whose photograph is missing from our wall. But all three were involved. We are termed as the original founders of the society. And just to quote from the formal founding of the Theosophical movement, these words were spoken. Our destiny is to continue the wide work of the past in affecting literature and thought throughout the world, while our ranks see many changing quantities, but always holding those who remain true to the program and refuse to become dogmatic or to give up common sense in theosophy. So, let us now have our first reading, which will be followed by our first talk. Then we will have two further readings and a second talk, and then a conclusion at the end. So, our first reader, I believe, is on Skype.
The multiplication of local centers should be a foremost consideration in your minds. And each man should strive to be a center of work in himself. When his inner development has reached a certain point, he will naturally draw those with whom he is in contact under the same influence. A nucleus will be formed around which other people will gather, forming a center from which information and spiritual influence radiate, and towards which higher influences are directed. But let no man set up a popery instead of theosophy, as this would be suicidal and has ever ended most fatally. We are all fellow students, more or less advanced, but no one belonging to the Theosophical Society ought to count himself as more than, at best, a pupil teacher, one who has no right to dogmatize. On the day when Theosophy will have accomplished its most holy and most important mission, namely to unite firmly a body of men of all nations in brotherly love and bent on a pure, altruistic work, not a labor with selfish motives. On that day only will Theosophy become higher than any nominal brotherhood of man. This will be a wonder and a miracle truly, for the realization of which humanity has vainly waited for the last 18 centuries, and which every association has hitherto failed to accomplish. It must be remembered that the society was not founded as a nursery for forcing a supply of occultists, as a factory for the manufacturing of adepts. It was intended to stem the current of materialism, and also that of spiritualistic phenomenalism and the worship of the dead. It had to guide the spiritual awakening that has now begun, and not to pander to psychic cravings, which are but another form of materialism. The tendency of modern civilization is a reaction towards animalism, towards a development of those qualities which conduce to the success in life of man as an animal in the struggle for animal existence. Theosophy seeks to develop the human nature in man, in addition to the animal, and at the sacrifice of the superfluous animality, which modern life and materialistic teachings have developed to a degree which is abnormal for the human being at this stage of his progress. Men cannot all be occultists, but they can all be theosophists. Many who have never heard of the society are theosophists without knowing it themselves. For the essence of theosophy is the perfect harmonizing of the divine with the human in man, the adjustment of his godlike qualities and aspirations, and their sway over the terrestrial or animal passions in him. Kindness, absence of every ill feeling or selfishness, charity, goodwill to all beings, and perfect justice to others as to oneself are its chief features. He who teaches theosophy preaches the gospel of goodwill, and the converse of this is also true. He who preaches the gospel of goodwill teaches theosophy. And now our first talk.
Friends, at the end of the article Yours Till Death and After, HPB, William Q. Judge recounted these words that H.P. Blavatsky had shared with him in London towards the close of her life. When you consider and remember those days in 1875 and after, in which you could not find any people interested in your thoughts, and now look at the wide-spreading influence of theosophical ideas, however labelled, it is not so bad. We are not working merely that people may call themselves theosophists, but that the doctrines we cherish may affect and leaven the whole mind of this century. This alone can be accomplished by a small, earnest band of workers who work for no human reward, no earthly recognition, but who, supported and sustained by a belief in that universal brotherhood of which our masters are a part, work steadily, faithfully, in understanding and putting forth for consideration the doctrines of life and duty that have come down to us from immemorial time. Falter not, so long as a few devoted ones will work to keep the nucleus existing. You were not directed to found and realize a universal brotherhood, but to form the nucleus for one. For it is only when the nucleus is formed that the accumulations can begin that will end in future years, however far, in the formation of that body which we have in view. So the title of this first talk of tonight is a question. Why was the Theosophical movement founded? The most customary way of answering that question would be to repeat the three main objects of the movement. First, to form the nucleus of universal brotherhood without any distinctions of race, religion, creed, caste, colour, gender, or anything else. Second, to promote the study of the world's religions, philosophies, and sciences, especially those of India and the East, and to show why such study is important. And thirdly, to investigate the hidden laws of nature and the psychic and supernormal powers latent in man. Those are always good to remind ourselves of, and yet there's more to it than that. How were those three objects intended to take form and definite expression? In what way was it to happen? And as we here are in the West, we may further ask, what was and is the Master's plan for making these three objects a reality here in the Western world? In November 1891, 6 months after the passing of HPB, her guru, the Master or Mahatma, known by the initial M, sent a letter via Mr. Judge to A.P. Sinnott. It said, "We sent him," that is William Judge, "to London," and this is referring to after HPB's death, "and made him stay so long in order to lay down currents which have since operated. The only thing we deplore is the sorrow of the world, which can only be cut off by the philosophy you were such a potent factor in bringing to the West, and which now other disciples are promulgating also. This is the age of the common people, although you may not agree, but so it is. And as we see forces at work and gathering by you unseen, we must commend all efforts that give widespread notice to even one word of the philosophy." Sinnott and some others, both then and perhaps even now, held to the opinion that theosophy is only for the intellectual and well-educated classes, and that there's little point making it available or accessible to the so-called average or ordinary person. Now this is a distinctly untheosophical and anti-theosophical point of view, and not shared by HPB, WQJ, or the masters behind the movement. It is said that theosophy is for those who want it, and that means regardless of background, upbringing, education, social class, intellectual status, or whatever. The very first page of the Ocean of Theosophy expresses that this body of knowledge, which we call the Theosophia, or divine wisdom, is truly like a vast ocean, sufficiently abstruse, abstract, metaphysical and profound in its deepest parts to give the greatest minds their fullest scope, and yet sufficiently accessible at its shores that even a child can comprehend and apply its fundamental principles. In his article, The Closing Cycle, Mr. Judge writes, "The cultured classes are perfectly worthless as a whole to the master builders of the lodge. They are good in the place they have, but they represent the established order and the acme of selfishness. Not the cultured, but the ignorant masses have kept alive the belief in the occult and the psychic, now fanned into flame once more. Had we trusted to the cultured, the small ember would long ago have been extinguished. We may drag in the cultured, but it will be but to have a languid and unenthusiastic interest. We have entered on the dim beginning of a new era already. It is the era of Western occultism and of special and definite treatment and exposition of theories hitherto generally considered. We have to do as Buddha told his disciples: preach, promulgate, expound, illustrate, and make clear in detail all the great things we have learned. That is our work, and not the bringing out of surprising things about clairvoyance and other astral matters, not the blinding of the eye of science by discoveries impossible for them, but easy for the occultist. The Master's plan has not altered. He gave it out long ago. It is to make the world at large better, to prepare a right soil for the growing out of the powers of the soul, which are dangerous if they spring up in our present selfish soil. It is not the Black Lodge that tries to keep back psychic development, it is the White Lodge. The Black would fain have all the psychic powers full flower now, because in our wicked, mean, hypocritical and money-getting people, they would soon wreck the race. We heard there of the dim beginning of a new era of Western occultism. Some of you may recall that at this year's annual Judge Day meeting at the end of March, we had a talk titled A New Era of Western Occultism, exploring what this really means and the numerous things Mr. Judge said about it. The first thing to realize is that it isn't suggesting that this is the era for a resurgence of Rosicrucianism or Hermeticism or the Kabbalah or Christian Gnosticism or Freemasonry or alchemy or any of those other systems which are commonly thought of as forms of Western occultism. Theosophy and the modern theosophical movement are defined by Eastern esotericism rather than Western. And Mr. Judge once wrote, the new Western occultism will not be something wholly different from and opposed to what so many know or think they know as Eastern occultism. What then did he mean? Well, Theosophy teaches that the newest and youngest race group to have been evolved is the so-called white race in the West, and also that the next major evolutionary cycle on this earth is to have its origins in America, because the intermixing there of so many different races, nationalities and cultures will give birth in due time to a new and ideally more advanced expression of human organism and type. But this doesn't mean that these places or nationalities are in any sense superior to others. On the contrary, they may be viewed from one perspective as being some of the least advanced in the world, due to their being so young in comparison with other, much older, and often much wiser races and nations. The concept of a new era of Western occultism is simply that at the present time, the newly evolving West needs an occultism, a philosophy, a system of esoteric study and development which will be properly suited for it, and which will help rather than hinder it in the correct and safe inner unfoldment of those souls who happen to be incarnated in the West. Theosophy is, of course, just as much for the East as for the West, as for anywhere and anyone else. Its influence in the East, in India and Asia, during HPB's time, was something tremendous, and it will again be so in the future. The main point of what we are discussing here is that it is Theosophy that the West needs, and not any exoteric Eastern practices and teachings from Hindu gurus, yogis and swamis, or Buddhist monks and lamas. If the latter were what was needed or were sufficient, the masters of the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood would not have bothered doing the great work they did through H.P. Blavatsky. Her work and writings were not intended, as is sometimes mistakenly thought, to open up people's minds ready for the influx to the West of popular Eastern spirituality. In fact, her work and writings do not do that. On the contrary, they present and provide a completely distinct system, having some surface similarities with what we know of as Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth, yet being something far deeper, far more explanatory, touching upon far more things, and being far more all-encompassing and universal. Partway through her major book, The Secret Doctrine, she states, "As a whole, neither the foregoing nor what follows can be found in full anywhere. It is not taught in any of the 6 Indian schools of philosophy, for it pertains to their synthesis, the 7th, which is the occult doctrine. And that is called in Sanskrit the Gupta Vidya, and in Greek the Theosophia. That is what we study, discuss, promulgate, and attempt to practice and apply here at the United Lodge of Theosophists. It is not, said Mr. Judge, the modern East with its yogis and fakirs, its hidebound castes, its subtle and magnificently intellectual theology, its hatha yoga and all the dangers attending that to which our thoughts and attention should be turned. Not, at any rate, if we happen to believe that the masters of wisdom know best." In Letters That Have Helped Me, page 73 to 75, we read these words from him. "The fact is significant that the theosophical movement was thus, as said, begun in the Western world, in the country where the preparations for the new root race are going on, and where that new root is to appear. This was not to give precedence to any one race or country over another, or to reduce any race or country, but was and is according to the law of cycles, which is a part of evolution. In the eye of that great law, no country is first or last, new or old, high or low, but each at the right time is appropriate for whatever the work is that must be performed. Each country is bound up with all the others and must assist them. This movement has, among others, an object which should be borne in mind. It is the union of the West with the East, the revival in the East of those greatnesses which once were hers, the development in the West of that occultism which is appropriate for it, so that it may, in its turn, hold out a helping hand to those of older blood who may have become fixed in one idea or degraded in spirituality. For many centuries this union has been worked towards, and workers have been sent out through the West to lay the foundations. But not until 1875 could a wide public effort be made, and then the Theosophical Society came into existence because the times were ripe and the workers ready. It is not the desire of the Brotherhood that those members of the Theosophical movement who have, under their rights, taken up a belief in the messengers and the message should become pilgrims to India. To arouse that thought was not the work nor the wish of HPB. Nor is it the desire of the Lodge to have members think that Eastern methods are to be followed, Eastern habits adopted, or the present East made the model or the goal. The West has its own work and its duty, its own life and development. Those it should perform, aspire to and follow, and not try to run to other fields where the duties of other men are to be performed. If the task of raising the spirituality of India, now degraded and almost suffocated, were easy, and if, thus easily raised, it could shine into and enlighten the whole world of the West, then, indeed, were the time wasted in beginning in the West, when a shorter and quicker way existed in the older land. But in fact it is more difficult to make an entry into the hearts and minds of people who, through much lapse of time in fixed metaphysical dogmatism, have built in the psychic and psychomental planes a hard, impervious shell around themselves, than it is to make that entry with Westerners, who, although they may be meat-eaters, yet have no fixed opinions, deep laid in a foundation of mysticism and buttressed with a pride inherited from the past. The new era of Western occultism definitely began in 1875 with the efforts of that noble woman who abandoned the body of that day not long ago. These are still the words of William Judge. It has, as its mission, largely entrusted to the hands of the Theosophical Society to furnish to the West that which it can never get from the East, to push forward and raise high on the circular path of evolution now rolling west, the light that lighteth every man who cometh into the world, the light of the true self, who is the one true master for every human being. All other masters are but servants of that true one. In it, all real lodges have their union. Can we grasp the seriousness of this? These are not just powerful and inspiring words for us to read, listen to, and feel good about. This is an explanation of the major part, or a major part, of the mission of the modern theosophical movement, which most of us attending and taking part in this special meeting today, whether here or online, have chosen to connect and associate ourselves with, thus making it our mission, individually and collectively. Even though the cyclic impulse may be there on unseen levels, it can never come about unless we do what is necessary to help it happen. We all have our part to play. There's a reason why we're all here tonight. No one truly comes to a meeting like this just for fun or for something to do or for social reasons. The converging lines of our karma have brought us together and joined us with this great force which is the theosophical movement, the great theosophical cause. These are some relevant excerpts from HPB's article titled Misconceptions. She said, "At present, the Brahmins are as ignorant of the occult sciences as the Buddhists of Ceylon. In India, among the 150 million Brahmins of every degree, one would not find 150 initiates, including the yogis and paramahamsas. Their temples have become cemeteries, where lie the corpses of their once beautiful symbols, and where reigns supreme superstition and exploitation. If it were different, why would American theosophists have gone to India? Why would have thousands of Brahmins entered the Theosophical Society, eager to belong to a centre where they might encounter from time to time a true Mahatma of flesh and blood from the other side of the great mountain? What do we Theosophists have to do with Brahmanism except to combat its abuses? What do we have in common with Orthodox Brahmanism? It should be clear at last that the Theosophists fight the Brahmanism of the pagodas, as they do all the superstitions, all the abuses, and all the injustices. Brahmins, those at least who have remained ultra-orthodox and who fight every benevolent reform, persecute us and hate us as much as do the Christian clergy and the missionaries. We break their idols, they endeavour to smash our reputations. The brotherhood of the Theosophists throughout India are the only ones who see the haughty Englishman sitting down at the same table with equally arrogant Brahmins, mellowed and humanized by the example and the lessons of the Theosophists who serve the masters of the ancient wisdom, the descendants of those rishis and mahatmas which Brahmanism has always revered, though it has ceased to understand them. It is not the priesthood of India that attempts to bring the Occident back to the ancient wisdom, but rather a few Occidentals from Europe, America, who, led by their karma to the happiness of knowing certain adepts of the secret Himalayan Brotherhood, attempt, under the inspiration of these masters, to lead the priesthood of India back to the primitive and divine esotericism. So this new era of Western occultism is not only for the benefit of the Western world, but ultimately for the benefit of the East as well. In his important article, The Truth About East and West, William Judge writes, "Where is the wrong in knowing the fact and in asserting that such an India of today, no matter how glorious it may have been 10,000 years ago, is not the teacher of the West? Rather is it that the West is to lead the reform and raise up the fallen country with all others. The centre, the top, the force of the cyclic wave of evolution is in the West, including Europe and America. This evolutionary wave is not a mere theoretical thing, but is a mass of revolving energy, composed of human egos from all the ancient ages of the past. It cannot be stopped. It should not be hindered in any way. This is what makes the importance of the West. The masters work scientifically, and not sentimentally or by hysterical impulse. They desired, one can see by viewing the history and the words from them of the last 20 years, the new and growing West, to take from all the East whatever philosophy and metaphysics were needed, to assimilate them, to put them into practice, to change the whole social and economic order, and then react back compulsorily upon the East for its good and uplifting. The Eastern lands, both India and other places, are storehouses for the world, holding from the past treasures that the West alone can make avail of and teach the East how to use. Let us all be careful that we do not inject into the mental sphere of the Theosophical Society any ideas arising from sentiment or from insufficient reflection which might become a hindrance, however slight, to the evolutionary impulse, or which might tend concretely to limit the expansion of the great work begun by HPB. All this may easily seem a far-off and unimaginable dream if we fall into the trap of thinking that the state of today's theosophical movement can be assessed by the number of people attending a theosophical meeting. For one thing, quality, not quantity, is what truly counts. And for another, the number of earnest, sincere, active students of the real theosophy of HPB and the Masters around the world is greater than one might think, and is actually steadily growing, thanks largely to the internet. There are reasons to be confident in the future of the movement, provided that those who care for it and who care for humanity do all in their power to study, learn, understand, apply, know the knowledge, live the life, so as to be able to be an active and effective part of it, consecrated in mind and heart to those great souls who still stand behind that which was established 141 years ago today. Much more could be said on these themes, but now we'll have the second reading.
From the writings of William Q. Judge. Though it was hoped that the mystery of life and the power over nature could be obtained in our time by mere intellectual development, very little indeed has been accomplished but instead we find ourselves, as the result of misdirected energies, in the abyss of modern materialism. The abolition alone of these tendencies and the insight into the inability to find the secret into the mystery of the all-pervading and unerring law of nature by physical means, the abolition and destruction of these tendencies is the bridge over which alone we may arrive at the enlightened shore of transcendental wisdom. At this present restless stage of discontent and the fruitless search for peace, the TS appeared with truly altruistic motives, reminding the perplexed age of the mistaken course it had taken in its illusion of separateness and in its denial of man's better nature. It is the aim of the TS to bring to the notice of those who are inclined to admit the spiritual nature of man and his progressive evolution, that on another plane of existence, a plane which partakes of a wider field of consciousness and which lies within the capability of development in every individual, that on that higher plane there is a spiritual unity, a universal brotherhood of mankind, and on that plane of being there is no separateness from homogeneous existence. And further, that no permanent progress is possible through fostering the illusion of separateness, and that man's true duty at all times and in all circumstances is the love of his kind and the preservation of harmony around him. It is with the endeavor to learn something concerning our position in life and our spiritual relation to each other that we come together weekly, some of us daily, to exchange our observations and experiences. It is premised that man is the product of an advanced stage of evolution, which is demonstrated by his possession of the more developed faculties of perception and consciousness compared with other organisms, his capability of analysis of physical nature, his inherent sense of moral duty, and his aspirations to know his relative position in cosmic evolution. When we observe the great intelligence and justice with which the minutest object in nature is governed, we can draw inference by analogy and apply to the human being. The same conditions prevail. The great universality of government, embracing all and moving all with inexorable certainty in obedience to one law and design, the interdependence of everything suggests the unity of all. Unity of life and being means brotherhood of all the units which make up that unity of life and being. And it is the conscious realization of this unity, the universal, all-pervading principle of brotherhood, that lends a basis and meaning to the phenomena of life and existence.
Thank you. And just before our second talk, a brief quote from Proverbs. Wisdom is a tree of life to those who embrace her. Those who lay hold of her will be blessed. Swiftness does not win the race, nor strength the battle. Surely wisdom is better than strength. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. And so now in our second talk we shall hear more on the subject of divine wisdom.
So, friends, in that reading that we had from William Judge, we thought we'd just go over some of the points that he made, because they're very succinctly expressed and there's so much in them. Now, one of the ideas he gave was that intellect alone, it can only misdirect the energies of society. And we can see this today. We've got wonderfully advanced academic and research institutions that produce all sorts of conclusions and reports on the state of things. But does that really help in the production of a society and a way of living that will bring contentment and happiness and peace to the world? And it seems that it doesn't. So there's something missing. And what Judge says is two things. Firstly, we need to abolish the tendency to seek answers only in material life. He says that there's a great tendency to go and look and study the physical sciences to try and get the answers for things. And he says that's a tendency we really have to abolish from ourselves. And that's quite a strong word. And the other tip he gives us is that we have to provide some deep insight into this failure of physical science to solve society's problems. And that insight needs to be rational and coherent and convincing, so that the scientists will, and social anthropologists and historians and everybody else will realize that we need to look beyond. We need to look deeper. Now, he says that it's the duty of theosophy to remind society that the idea of separateness and the denial of man's better nature are a mistaken course, and that mistake must be corrected. We have to fight the idea that we're separate individuals who are not interdependent. And we have to realize and demonstrate that we have a higher nature that can be discovered. And he says that illusion of separateness is a false idea that will give no lasting progress. And I think we can see that in life. I mean, one of the great ideals, sadly, in the new world of North America is this illusion of man's independence, of this idea that we can be completely self-sufficient and independent of the suffering or well-being of others, and that each person can sort of build his own world and life. And I mean, in one sense, it's a noble ideal that we shouldn't rely on other people. But when taken to an extreme, it produces all sorts of problems. Now, the title of the talk is What is Divine Wisdom? Now, we could just read some quotations about what divine wisdom is, but really, in order to try to understand more about the importance and the relevance and how it applies and what effect of its study can have, we need to contextualize it. So rather than just making a statement or proposition, once we do that, we've got to compare this theosophical idea of divine wisdom with its earlier prototypes. We need to discuss the differences between the different concepts of wisdom. And that discussion of differences will lead to an implied revision of our ideas. And it's only by revising our ideas that we can come to propose new solutions to these problems that we see around us in the world. Because all those problems are ultimately arise from wrong ideas held about man, about nature, about evolution, about our place in the cosmos, about what man's destiny is. And theosophy was brought into the world in order to change man's thinking, to change man's literature, to change man's outlook, his worldview. And it's through those changes, which are incredibly influential in the long run, that the ideas and applications of how society should be run, how our politics should work, how people should work together and cooperate, all those really practical things will come ultimately from the inherent ideas that our population as a whole holds. Now, as was said in the first talk, this new era that we're entering in of Western occultism is actually not so much one of the old era, which was very hierarchical, dominated by organization, by conformance to ritual, by an absence of free thought. Instead, the new era is one of the common people. It's one of cooperative sharing of ideas, of helping each other to solve the problems which we've been responsible in creating. Now, so part of that research is to result in suggestions that hopefully give a wider acceptance and a more beneficial result. Now that really is a revolution. What HPB was involved with was, we can call it a revolution or a reformation. It was to, and those things, those reforms are never easily brought about. Now, the adoption has to be through reason and not coercion. And that's very, very important. Buddha's great reforms were achieved with a bloodless revolution, a peaceful revolution, or reformation, perhaps is a better word. Because revolution suggests, if you look in the dictionary, something a bit that has a hint of illegality about it. But that's not theosophy. Theosophy is ultimately the restitution of the great laws of nature, the great understandings of how we relate to each other, of how karma operates, of the appreciation of our place in nature, of our rightful place, of our right conduct, of our right understanding of how to cooperate with nature and with the evolutionary laws. So there must be never any sense of coercion. Now, on the other hand, we have to be robust in our defense of those who would try to upset or spoil that reform. And those are normally ones who have benefited and prospered due to this unjust status quo, and they're always in the minority because it's always just a few who manage to turn things to their advantage to the expense of the many. And those are the ones that do try to resist reform. They prefer the status quo, which benefits them. And in that, theosophy has a struggle for recognition. It has to fight for the acceptance by reasonably minded people, and to offset the negative propaganda that's aimed at it from those who are in a position of privilege and power and who don't wish to see any changes. Now, one of the ways of doing this is, and it's the duty and role of students of theosophy, is to give a good account of the philosophy. It's to enable a fair comparison of the different options that are available for humanity to take. Now, this selection of the best options or the best explanations is something which we've mentioned before, and it's recognized in science as being a very controversial area, in that even impartial, fair-minded, honest scientists have difficulty in selecting what is the best explanation. And some of the guidance that's given in this recognized sort of mental, psychological deficiency that we have, some of the guidance that is given is to choose a solution that has a depth of understanding, a comprehensiveness of solution that is simple, and simplicity is a great virtue, and that also has something which they call a unifying power. And it's the unifying power of theosophy which is so appealing to those who study it. It has the power to bring the disparate elements together and to unify it. And those, if we judge the selection of options based on those simple criteria of depth, comprehensiveness, simplicity, and unifying power, then that can only be of benefit to the acceptance of this ancient and perennial wisdom tradition of what divine wisdom really is. So we need to emphasize those things, and we need to point them out as being right things to do. Because as we read on Wednesday, theosophy has a struggle for recognition. Now, why is that struggle so fierce? Why is theosophy still engaged after 141 years, 17th of November, still not so widely accepted? It's not so widely reported. It's not taken seriously by the great thinkers. Well, part of the idea, just to give an example, in psychology or philosophy, you've got this great tendency at the moment of what we said earlier that Judge pointed to, which is the looking for answers in the physical world. Now, it's called in scientific terms epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism. And epiphenomenalism just simply means that the physical basis of life has the most important or the most powerful causative effect. It's where causes are generated on the material plane. Now that is a very odd, to a theosophical or philosophical student, a very odd proposition, but it's really one that's still in the ascendant. Epiphenomenalism is the normal, mainstream, accepted idea in psychology that the brain produces consciousness, that mental states are a result of physical change. Now that is entirely the opposite of the ancient spiritual teaching in the West. I mean, for instance, if you look at the Hindu idea of the seven Saktis or powers in man, these latent powers, which Judge said that we should try to point towards. One of them, Kriya Shakti, is the power of the force of thought to make changes on the physical world. Now that's the opposite of epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism has turned that idea on its head. But if you study the Saktis, Kriya Shakti, for instance, is the power of thought, we can see that some of the modern scientists are beginning to explore that very fruitful area of research. For instance, you've got Dr. Sheldrake, whose work on telepathy has been scientifically exploring that idea. And he's set up, some of you may know some of his experiments that are run on a computer, or you can do it over the telephone, randomized trials that give very highly significant probabilistic indications of something happening due to the power of thought that is beyond and above any physical phenomena. It happens telepathically between people. Another very good example in recent years has been the work of the Japanese famous researcher into water crystals, Dr. Emoto, and his research that's showing the force of thought can have on the formation of water crystals. And that depending on the type of thought that you hold at a particular moment of concentration, and as those water crystals are forming, they seem to be impressed by the thought that you hold and project, and that the type of thought, whether it's harmonious or beneficial or ugly or violent, the type of thought can actually alter the form of the crystal and the pleasing geometrical harmonious form that comes with natural good, pleasant, kind, loving thoughts, or the opposite of crystals which are misshapen, malformed, just simply to look at them you can see that they're not they don't have any symmetry, they lack coherence and structure and harmony, and those come from thoughts which are violent or selfish or aggressive. Now those are just some ideas, and those ideas should eventually give, hopefully, the death knell to this mistaken idea of the power of matter over mind, and that we should try to reconstitute our ideas to believe that mind over matter is the natural order of the universe. Now, this brings us on to what could be said about divine wisdom. And HPB speaks of divine wisdom as being diffused throughout an infinite universe. Divine wisdom is diffused throughout the infinite universe. And that our higher self is an integral part of that divine wisdom. So we are a child of the universe. We're not simply a biological accidental conglomeration into an animal form. We have a mind principle that is first and foremost, it comes before the body, and it will outlast after our body has disappeared, and it will reincarnate in future bodies. And she says that our higher self is an integral part of that universal diffusion. And she calls it the atmic light, which can be centered only in that which is eternal, but still individualized. And she calls that the noetic principle, or the buddhi manas. And that noetic principle is the manifested deity, which is in every being. It's, if you like, in theosophical terms, it's higher manas in union with buddhi, so that conjunction. And that is the access that we have to the divine wisdom. And she says it's this atmic light, or collective light, which is the wisdom that is from above. And when that collective light descends into our personal egoic consciousness, it's found to be something that is pure, peaceable, and gentle. That atmic light comes and illuminates our consciousness with that type of higher spiritual realization. Pure, peaceable, and gentle. And it's called, she calls it ancient. And that ancient is because it's always the firstborn. She uses the expression alaya mahat. Alaya is, if you like, the universal world soul. And it's the universal soul and the intelligence of the universe. And then she gives an example of how that comes up, for instance, in the Bible, in Job. The Bible talks about the ancient, which is the wisdom and the length of days. Now, esoterically speaking, that means the ancient is man's higher ego. The ancient being simply a synonym for the reincarnating part of one. It's ancient because we've always had it. And so the ancient is wisdom, and the length of days simply means the number of reincarnations during which time that wisdom has been accumulated. So if you like, that's an esoteric key to reading that statement in Job. And she goes on to say that no person can learn true wisdom in one birth, but that in every new birth there are lessons that we need to receive at the hands of what she calls the just, but ever stern schoolmaster of karmic life. And she says that's why we're here, to learn from that schoolmaster. And she says that truth and wisdom are interchangeable or synonymous terms. And that which is true must be wise, and that which is false or pernicious must be unwise. Now let's just go back and return to some of the ideas that we had from Judge. Now, what is the practical application of studying divine ethics? Because in its real essence, wisdom can only really manifest itself in a practical way through ethics. Now, in 1880, at the very early part of when Madame Blavatsky was in India with Colonel Olcott, setting up the Theosophical Society in India after they'd left America, and they'd left William Judge in America to carry on the work there. And they went in 1879 to India. A year later, HPB's master's master, which he calls the para guru, the Maha Chohan, wrote a very important letter called the Great Master's Letter. And in it he talks about the moral code or this idea of ethics. And he gives it as truthfulness, purity, self-denial, charity. And he says it's that moral code which will enable us to distinguish progress from barbarism. And it's that which we need to promulgate. Truthfulness, charity, self-denial, purity. And it's that which will set man away from the path of barbarism to progress. And really alone will enable humanity's aspirations towards the reign of law. And it's that reign of law which can facilitate an intelligent unfolding of the potential latent goodness that's hidden in each person. But that potential latent goodness which is hidden in each needs special conditions for its growth to come about. It can't come about in an atmosphere of mistrust or lawlessness or selfishness. The growth which we try to stimulate in each other and help each other unfold needs a protective environment. It's like the seedling that grows up. It has to be sheltered from the raw elemental forces of nature. And we, in the same way, have to shelter ourselves and our fellow colleagues and beings and students from those raw elemental forces. In the same way that a forestry, when a forestry grows up and covers barren land, it provides shelter from the burning sun, it provides shelter from the wind. And a forest will actually produce its own microclimate in which the seedlings can grow and attain strength and be strong enough to then shelter in their turn the other smaller seedlings. So that's something that's very much part of the theosophical tradition, and if it's found in ideas like the Guru Parampara chain, which we rely on those masters, those great souls above us, to help humanity to foster the right conditions in which intelligent, sympathetic development and learning can come about. And those are some of the things that we have to try to do. And in a lodge, we try to create the conditions of that special protection and environment where people feel encouraged and comfortable and enthused to be able to throw off the outside forces that are always impinging on us, and to have the confidence and generosity of spirit to make self-sacrifices, to think that by our efforts, as was said in the second talk, to think that the efforts that we make, even though we're small in number, can actually have a very powerful and enlivening effect on the mind of the race. Now, as we heard in Judge's article today, that one of the effects of the study of divine wisdom is an appreciation for what the voice of the silence calls the fitness of all things. The fitness of all things. Now, to be able to perceive the fitness of all things, it's like Krishna said in the Gita to Arjuna. He teaches only the one who finds no fault. if we're in a nitpicking frame of mind, if we're in a skeptical frame of mind, if we're in a frame of mind that's defensive, then we are not able to open ourselves up to the inner wisdom that's latent inside us. And Krishna says, to one who finds no fault, I will make known to thee this secret knowledge. And Judge has obviously reached that stage of being able to look at nature, and as he says, he perceived, like many other mystics, what he describes as a great intelligence and justice in nature. And to be able to see that great intelligence and justice in nature is to see the workings of nature's laws, and to find that they do have a coherence and a justice and a sense of fairness, and that we rely on karma to provide just the conditions that we need, even though they may be, in individual cases, quite difficult. But nevertheless, acceptance is one of the tests, one of the trials that we have to face when bearing.
Is from the writings of Robert Crosby. It is because there are those in the world desirous of helping humanity to proceed further that we are not worse off. Often the ideas given out by men in high places are not the result of their own cogitations, although thought to be such. Many an idea is received by those who have the ear of the public, who speak and will be heard, from those with a far deeper knowledge of the issues at stake, yet whose voices would not be heard at all. So though there may seem to be little action on the part of theosophical disciples, there is much action on inner planes of being, and that action never but for the benefit of humanity. If only once any considerable number of persons could take the true position and act from the true nature, right ideas would soon spread all over the earth. Once the ideas are implanted in our minds, we can help the world by speaking of them and by exemplifying them. We can do that much, however selfishly the world moves on. A true league of humanity could be formed without social distinctions, class distinctions, national distinctions. In their stead would come a common perception and a common realization of the universe and a common course for humanity. We must know that we are all of other peoples. We came through all the civilizations that have been. We have passed through the Eastern, the Near East, and the European peoples, and now we are here at the farthest confines of the West, under the law of karma. Civilization must roll back over the course it came, and as it goes back in spirit, speech, act, and example towards the East from which it came, the misconceptions that have arisen around religious and other ideas will be cleared away by the power of our knowledge and example. We are here as the best representatives of the world of the people. The best representatives of the people of the world, the most intelligent, the freest in mind and opinion, the freest in action. All that means something under law, and it means that every being coming in contact with the ancient wisdom has an opportunity devolved upon him. We have not met for the first time, nor have we met for the last. Once more we are together and listening to what we do absolutely know inside. There is that in us which sees and knows when the word is spoken, and which gives first indication of the life within a life, of a life greater than this we have conceived life to be. Then we begin to tread that small old path that stretches far away, the path that our great predecessors, the masters, have trod before us.
So friends, it's said that a distinction has to be made between the idea of the Theosophical movement and that of the Theosophical Society. The movement began far back in the night of time and has since been moving through many and various peoples, places and environments. It is to be found in all times and among all nations. Wherever thought has struggled to be free, wherever spiritual ideas, as opposed to forms and dogmatism, have been promulgated, there the great movement is to be discerned. The Theosophical movement is moral, ethical, spiritual, universal, invisible, save in effect, and continuous. A Theosophical Society is a visible organization, a body of students working in more or less of harmony and understanding. Hence, organizations of Theosophists must vary and change in accordance with place, time, exigency and circumstance. Being made by men for their better cooperation, organized theosophical bodies must change from time to time as human defects come out, as the times change, and as the great underlying spiritual movement compels such alterations. The real unity and prevalence, the real internationalism of the Theosophical movement are therefore not to be looked for in any form of organization, but are to be found in the similarity of aim, of aspiration, purpose, of teaching and of ethics. And this concept of the new wave of occultism has been mentioned a few times this evening. And in an article entitled "The New Cycle" by H.P. Blavatsky, writing around 1889, she spoke of the beginning of a new cycle at the end of the 19th century, which ushered in a new evolutionary impulse and fostered the and quoting her own words, we are once again, the hour has struck for the great periodical return of the rising tide of mystic thought in Europe. And we heard that Europe, or the West, at this time in history is the leading force of civilization, of humanity in this cycle, the culmination of all the previous civilizations which have gone to make up it and influence it. She also, in the same article, speaks of the coming great battle between the forces of blind and brutal materialism and blind fanaticism on the one hand, and on the other philosophy and mysticism, the more or less thick veil of the eternal truth. But she predicts that it is not materialism that will have the upper hand. But nevertheless, she urges all true and sincere theosophists to become true soldiers of truth in this great battle, to each play his part as best to the best of his ability and according to his own personal judgment. So just to conclude with a few quotes from WQJ, one of the three founders of the Modern Theosophical Society. Noble hearts still walk here, fighting over again the ancient fight. They seek each other so as to be of mutual help. We will not fail them. To fail would be nothing, but to stop working for humanity and brotherhood would be awful. We cannot, we will not. Have courage, patience, hope, faith and cheerfulness. The age is black as hell, hard as iron. It is iron. It is Kali Yuga. Yet Kali Yuga by its very nature is terrible, swift momentum. Permits one to do more with his energies in a shorter time than in any other yuga. Patriotism consists in theosophizing our own nation, in not only getting ourselves rid of our national defects, as well as other members of the nation rid of the same, but also in strengthening in ourselves and in our nation as a whole all the noble qualities which belong to our nation. In the enjoyment of the privileges of the nation and using them as a means for the performance of Dharma, and we could apply the same principal idea of theosophizing our own nation to theosophizing all the nations, theosophizing the whole world, theosophizing the whole of humanity. But of course it begins with each individual to do the work. So it remains only for us to thank our speakers and readers this evening, and to thank you all for joining us on this this momentous commemoration, which is special, not least of all because for the first time at this lodge we've been able to hold it on the actual day, the 17th. So I hope you can join us on Sunday for the talk about gratefulness. And just before we disperse this evening, we ask each and all to express a sincere greetings to his comrade and co-worker, and to wish each other well in the great battle that lies ahead.